all of you that have joined us so far. And now we are joined by our friends on Facebook. I'm Terry Henney, farm broadcaster from WSGW Radio in Saginaw, Michigan. I am on location today. That's the reason why the background is not a familiar background to most of you who've been watching these webinars. And the other addition is the headphones and the speaker, because I am at Krijak's house in Bay City. It is Fat Tuesday. It is Punchki Day. And these folks make somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 punchkis. And they start selling them, well, yesterday and all the way through the day today. It's a part of a fundraising event as well. They donate, I don't know how much money they have donated so far over the years, but they donate somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000 to $4,000 to the Bay City Salvation Army, which helps a lot of those folks that need help and obviously need something to eat. So that's one of the reasons why we do this. And we've been around here since about 5:30, 5:45 this morning, and we'll be here long after we're done with Coffee with Corn. This reminder now, Jim Zook will be joining us as well. Jim is the executive director of the Corn Marketing Program of Michigan. He's going to help field some of the questions we're going to have for our guests today. If you do have questions as our speaker is going through his presentation, just go down to the Q&A on your Zoom, or if you are watching us on Facebook, you can go ahead and type it in the comment section, and we'll try to field those questions and get as many of them answered as time will allow. Now, as I said, this is being broadcast simultaneously on Facebook, on our WSGW Facebook, our Farm Service Facebook, our Facebook, WCEN 94.5 The Moose, Corn Growers Facebook as well. And of course, the website that you can take a look at. And if you'd like to look at this afterwards, if you joining us a little bit late and you want to see it, or there's some facts and figures that our speaker is going to be giving you that you think you'd really like to hear again, you'll be able to do that. That's the reason why we're doing what we're doing, and that's why we're presenting the way we are. Now, if you want to get your RUP and your CCA credits, please remember, you have to be viewing on the Zoom for that, not on the Facebook, on the Zoom. As we finalize everything at the end, Claire will be walking you through that process. And again, that is on the Zoom. So you're going to have to be watching us there. Without further ado, I want to introduce, first of all, Jim Zook. Jim, good morning. How are you this morning?
Hey, good morning, Terry. And I fit that, what today is, the Fat Tuesday. I fit that mold very well. So hopefully everybody else will enjoy what we have today. And, you know, it's a little bit white out there today, but I think everybody is going to be able to be in and be warm and get some good knowledge today.
I think so. And I think we should probably get right to our featured guest this morning, because I know he's got a lot of really pertinent information for us. So Jim, why don't you introduce our speaker?
It is my pleasure to bring to you Dr. Bruno Basso. The Corn Marketing Program has been working with Dr. Basso for a number of years. I believe it's probably going on 5-6 years. It's really kind of molding our thoughts and how we look at fields, how we manage fields, and just the data that's out there and available to many of our growers. And so Bruno is going to talk to us today a little bit about how we should look at that data, how we should manage that, and some of the findings that he has. So with further ado, Dr. Basso, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I should be able to share. Please let me know if you can see the screen.
Yep.
One screen.
We can see yours.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody, and thank you again, Jim, and on behalf of the corn growers for inviting me today. It's always a pleasure to present information that we really care and work hard on getting the highest quality of science to help growers. And that's the goal today, is to be able to show you how we can together work to map a greener future. So it's going to be hopefully quite a bit of new information. As you know, just because we said, new and just data was mentioned by Jim, everybody is very well aware of the digital revolution around us in agriculture, whether we like it or not. But there are an extensive number of both publications, across board. The paper there on the left that mentions the future of agriculture was an article in the highly high-profile scientific journal of Nature that always kind of ignored agriculture in a way. And so now there's a significant attention because of advances in robotics, like the little guy here in the lower left, able to measure the size of the corn stalks and the size of the ear as this fellow goes through the corn rows. It is still much more on the research arena, be able to be transferred takes still quite a bit of work, and we have to convert this into something that is useful. So this is still, again, in the research domain by looking at different phenotypes and, like different features of new genetics. And you probably recognize, one of the latest machine designed to irrigate by 360, completely automated, and or possibility of quantifying carbon credits, or even spraying from a drone. The legislation is not there, but actually I'm working closely to possibly that becoming more of a reality, because the spoon feeding the crop will be beneficial both for the crop as well as for the environment. And then I had the opportunity, I had a feature article in Forbes on how this new digital agriculture is coming together. So just to walk you through, we have had just different times of breakthroughs in agriculture. In the early 1900s, beginning of mechanization has allowed us to cultivate a much larger area. That did not come without problems. As you know, the tillage event followed by bare soil led to the Dust Bowl, but at the same time, the development of the Soil Conservation Service. And so we realized how critical soil was, and we start working on that and continue to do so, because soil is the key to maintain productivity, and we need to look after that. Then in the 50s, fertilizer and agrochemicals, as you know, 1990s, new genetics, not just genetically modified, just new way of breeding, but then later modified organisms to be able to be more efficient, resistant to diseases. And then in the 2010s, more recently, you see that agriculture, even some of the big companies claim to be, now we are a data company, because we collect data so extensively from producers, and we can learn a lot from this data and be able to help them. Well, that's true in many ways, but it's not a straight path, right? And so what's next? What's in the future? Well, we have new satellites coming in. Shoebox, the sizes of a shoebox, thousands of them, monitoring the Earth every single day at a high resolution. Sub-meter resolution is going to come. Now, the highest resolution, it's still at a higher cost, 50 centimeters. A very acceptable cost is 3 meters every single day. So you got this all big data, you got spraying drones, sensors, you got omic sciences, meaning, metabolomics, so all the improvements of genetics going into that, microbes that have been engineered carbon farming, critical piece for growers, critical to be able to allow unproductive piece of land to be able to sequester carbon and reduce pollution, while on the productive land continue to intensify and boost yields. And then next gen biofertilizer, basically fertilizer produced by microbes. And so under that, there's a category that we think it's called digital twins, right? And so let me give you what is a digital twin. A digital twin, it's simply a virtual model of a process, a product, of a service. So anything that we do, we don't do trial and error anymore. We just basically, we compare the virtual world with the physical world and be able to analyze, model, and monitor anything that goes on. So to head off problem before they even occur, prevent downtime, develop new opportunities. I know this may seem like, oh my God, this is, unfortunately, it's unprevented, you just unstoppable. That's the way technology works. If the technology that will work and solve problem will make it through. The others, like anything else, will not be successful. So the possibility of having things on computer and simulate and design a system is the way a digital twin basically for the modern agriculture. And Jim knows this well. We have worked on extensively amount of modeling, be able to reproduce. We can reproduce really, really close a computer on the computer a corn plant with every single details and be able to simulate yield before the end of the year. And this information has been shared with farmers independently without knowing what the yield was. And we are constantly for the last 5-6 years being extremely close to the predicted yield, to the observed yield, and basically a month ahead of time. So another interesting, I want to take a step back. I'm going to walk you through a lot of new things that we've been doing, but also share, information that can be useful in terms of general knowledge, and then go deep into, how we process this extensive amount of data. And so if you may, obviously, how critical corn is and how broadly grown it is. The map on the right shows with the yellow indicating where corn is grown across the US, pretty large acreage of 92 million acres on average, and 84 million of soybeans, great value, economic values, and most importantly, the capacity to pull CO2 from the atmosphere. Incredibly, it's the king of the crop by no comparison by the amount of biomass and CO2 that is sequestered in corn. In fact, from a completely independent study from measuring fluorescence, so the amount of photosynthesis, the excitement that happens in a leaf with the electrons, and the corn belt outproduces the Amazon during the peak vegetation. There is more photosynthesis, more CO2 pulled out in the corn belt than the Amazon. So variability is what I will be talking about because you can no longer ignore it. It's just, it's there, it's very quantifiable, and it's understood. It is difficult in the sense that it's tricky because it's a system. It's not just one component. So if you think that you got it, that everything is function of climate, then you got that wrong. It's a combination of climate, soil, topography, management, genetics, and ultimately converting that into how consistent the yield is from one year being areas that they constantly produce well, or years that they, parts of the fields where they fluctuate from one year to another. 1 year is good, 1 year is bad. Okay, so with this in mind, anyone that grows corn on a crop realizes that climate changes from one year to the other, potentially within the farm, but you have to have a really big farm. But otherwise, basically soil, you have significant variation of soil texture, soil depth, drainage capacity, poorly drained in some parts of the field and better in others. Fertility, the natural soil organic matter, which is a compounding effect. The areas that produce higher return higher amount of residues. basically regenerate continuously these soils. It builds aggregate stability, builds the soil health. But in areas where the yield is low, which is constantly low, and any farmers knows those areas, then fertility goes its way down. And it doesn't necessarily help to bring chemistry to bring it back if the reason for not having yields, it wasn't fertility at the first place, but it was a combination of other factors. For example, a sloping land, a very shallow soil, not be able to hold as much water. So topography, and we think obviously the Midwest is rather flat. It takes very little rolling terrain to move water around. And so you have differences in elevation, hilltops, the slopes, depressions, and then management. Anyone knows how much the heterogeneity of the stand is predominant. And we have been studying that inside out to see how plant emergence affects the final yield and yield components. And it is striking how that is critical. We even learned how plants will basically count on neighbors to decide how much to grow and so on. So you'll hear more about that. Genetics, new traits, possibility of putting more plants up to 50,000 seeds and be able to reach incredibly high record yields, like over 600 bushels, as you know, and close to 500 observed in Michigan. So yield stability and then, like I mentioned earlier, gets translated. It is basically the ultimate integrator of these systems. So a system approach is what I mean is like you can't look at the corn or the crop in general from a single land. So what are these two diagrams? The one on top, it's the way, not trying to necessarily understand the details, but it's like each box is connected. So you can simply read the weather is connected to the soil, the management is connected to the soil to the roots, the crops, the biogenetic. So this is how we simulate a crop. This is how we understand how the interaction of the weather, very, very simply, corn takes 52-degree days, thermal units, to put a new leaf out. Well, it takes very little to predict that because we know the weather, we know the base temperature of corn being 50 Fahrenheit. So you accumulate, the relative development on every single day, and you know how many it takes to grow a leaf in corn versus in Michigan versus in other locations. Okay, so the system is critical, but then the system is at the center. Here I'm translating it as more of an artificial intelligence, but you need all the other components going in. Remote sensing is a critical piece because it detects a spatial variation. Robotics, all the new data, robotics even intended the yield monitor, be able to automatically observe yield variation, drones and on measurements for soils, and we have expanding more just to learn how the plants work, not necessarily have transfer on large scale, but it's coming basically in planta sensors. So sensors mounted on the plants, be able to, through genetics, to be able to convert some of the fluorescence. So I'm working with colleagues and trying to turn, have a plant turn into some signal if they're exposed to something. And so there is quite a bit of advancement that slowly trickled down to directly application on farms, all under computational science. And eventually we need to work all together to inform, the policy, the prices, the industry, what is needed, what we want, what's needed in order to have, optimal production and reduced environmental impact. So an example now, I'm going to go quickly through some of the Michigan description of corn. Okay, you may not have seen some of that. This is very simple. We have a way of characterizing every single year in the way the distribution of the variables work. So you had a beautiful seminar last week. It was much more on the forecast. We use historical weather to understand. If you can understand the past, you can infer about the future. And so you know what a normal weather could look like. And so the point of this slide is basically minimum temperature, maximum temperature, and rainfall could have a very wide range. And so when you make a decision, you're not just acting alone on a single variable, but you got to take everything into consideration. So let's look at the example of rain. You can go as low as 10 inches over 27 inches within a year, right? Between years. And so you don't know what's coming, but you know how the weather progresses, and you know the probability of outcomes, and be able to, through a system before you implement that change. And so minimum temperature from 48 to 58, or temperature. Interesting, I'm not going to go through, but we are witnessing, and there is a paper coming out in Nature Communication in the next couple of weeks, where we learned what's happening in Michigan and across the Midwest in terms of future climate and what has changed. It's the maximum temperature is getting cooler. It's getting not warmer, but it's still warm. I mean, it's the maximum temperature are the 90-degree days. It's getting cooler. The minimum temperature is getting higher, hotter. And so the warming is occurring by measurements as a result of increases in night temperatures and minimum temperature, which basically increases the amount of humidity in the atmosphere, requiring a little bit of less evapotranspiration. So basically potential ET is going down because of the greater humidity, but also because Michigan is getting wetter. And so that's something to consider how you make this decision. So climate variability, soil variability. You think soils and fields are uniform? Well, good luck with that. That's a 10 meters, so 30 meters resolution. Pretty well described from a general texture point of view. And so that's basically to account, you can zoom in, and we have a capacity of doing this throughout the continental US, as you'll see as we move through soils. So now, as a result of surveys, interviews, and working closely with farmers, I'm going to share the results of what we have learned across some of the high-producing farmers across the state. And so what do they report in combination of what we know in terms of dominant soil? So this is about roughly 2,000 or so high quality data. The numbers were greater. There were a lot of responses or other things that we couldn't use. This is a project funded by NIFA, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, in collaboration with agricultural economist, Dr. Frank Lupi, and I and others in the team have been looking at these variations, but also modeling the impact of changes in fertilizer, both nitrogen and phosphorus. So soil type, you have soil depth. Basically, what is the top soil? Is it, a lot of the farmers reported is not greater than 10 inches. Some go deeper, and some described, good soils. Average slopes, so I'll go a little bit faster here, but we have a feel of how nitrogen is managed also. And we can always remember, we can always look at from above. So applied pre-plants, there is yes or no. It's about split there in terms of numbers. Applying nitrogen and planting, applying at side dressing. So it's good to see a large numbers of producers applying at side dressing because of the way to watch principle. You don't want to put nitrogen all at the beginning if you're going to have potentially a dry year, or opposite, too much. So you just have to wait and watch, and possibly wait as much as possible. And the use of remote sensing is very helpful in making spatial decision and identifying, areas that they are ahead of the game versus areas that behind. Nitrogen fertilizer, this is the amount of rates that farmers report. Some didn't report the numbers and so on. So we got a good understanding, and again, genotypes, what are a typical planting date goes from roughly beginning of May 15 in some parts, and you see the shift north. And also interesting, the corn maturity today is roughly, it fluctuates between 95 to 105 in the core of Michigan, and going, faster days, 85 days or so, maturity groups in the north. Manure application, not as large, but when we understand how much manure is applied and when it's applied, fall, winter, and we know the restrictions. So that's going to change soon. Applied phosphorus, and it is applied. Just the back of the envelope, there is lots of phosphorus in these soils. So if you look at the center map of the phosphorus content in soils in the topsoil, the rule of thumb is if you multiply ppm by 2 on a general soil of basically sandy loam, except the very extreme with bulk density that is different, multiplied by 2, it gives you the pounds per acre. So on average, you can see the numbers really fluctuate between 40 to 80 ppm. That means 80 to 150 pounds per acre is available already in the soil. Formulation, the type of phosphorus that is applied, as we know, is mostly rain-fed. Irrigation only in the southwest is a little bit more irrigated on the west side. And these are the ranges of yield in Michigan. Do pretty well on an average, shooting about, the national average of about 171 bushels per acre, but with points of much higher in many places. Tillage, what is used in terms of timing and the type of cultivator. I wish we could see a little bit more reduced tillage and non-inversion tillage, but there is a good fare of conservation tillage going on, even though the majority is still more of a conventional tillage, which is not very favorable for carbon. So this is the yield observed. We simulate, we did a relatively good job, completely uncalibrated, and you'll see more zoom out of this as we go by. So one of the reasons, and Jim knows this well, corn growers have contributed immensely to the success of these projects and be able to get growers data to help them make better decisions and learning about the variability. So we are in a position to be able to speak because of high quality observation of data. And so we have, which have remained completely, obviously confidential. They're not shared except our groups to the companies that will pay a large amount of money, I guess, to learn more about what we have. And so we have nearly 7,400 yield maps, many years across a large number of years. At the same time of having a yield map, the thing fluctuating there, you'll see a zoom out in a second. But we have airborne imagery. So we work with a commercial company, Air Scout, that provides very timely information, both of optical sensing as well as thermal sensing. We are working on scaling on both directions. We have a fleet of drones, and we also have satellite imagery, clear images almost every day at 3-meter resolution. Management data has applied, and so we're learning a lot just by understanding. If you put yourself into the position of a farmer to understand variability is difficult. So just briefly, remote sensing, why is it important? Why can we rely it? People say, but how can a satellite is 30,000 miles up in the sky? How can they ever look at, at a resolution of 3 meters or look at chlorophyll? And, well, it's a physical principle. It's not, we just see how much light is reflected back. Same thing as what you saw about the photosynthesis being greater than the Amazon. So when we look at numbers, right? Well, what we get is a number. For example, you know how numbers work, but our sensors is well, in this case, it's the sensor, but we're doing a remote sensing of action right at this moment. We're looking at, the color in green because that particular component there reflects the light of the electromagnetic spectrum in the green. And so numbers, if you see things fully green and nothing else, you will have 0 in the blue, 255 bits in the green, and 0 in the red, and they fluctuate. So we get numbers, and these numbers are then converted into absorbance or reflectance. And so we see plant. I always ask this question, which is great. If you see a plant that has high reflectance in the green, what does it mean? It does not mean necessarily a good thing. It means that is a lighter green. when you see a corn plant that is lighter green, you worry. It should be darker green, okay? So it needs to absorb more light. And so because the black line there, it's an example of a spectral signature. This is how the plants reflect the light. And so just by looking at these numbers, we realize what's a healthy plant, what's a stressed plant. And you go back in time through the season and you realize, well, this has been sick in a way, not just disease sick, but just being behind. There's been lower canopies. And so you realize this is something more chronicle, and we need to pay attention on those areas. And that's how, when we deal with this, these are terabytes of data and information that, thanks to the funding, we're able to maintain, people, high quality members in the lab to process this information quickly. Same thing of this. These are thousands and thousands of pixels. And a farmer will have our time understanding this spatial and temporal variation. Every single year, it does not look the same, which is very important for you to understand that yield is not driven just by soil. If it was soil, the soil does not change from one year to the next. Okay, so the map should look alike if it was soil driven, but it is a system. It is the weather that interacts with the position in the landscape, interacts with how well you manage the crop. Did you till in the wrong time? Did you plant it poorly that some of these plants did not emerge in time? And so on. There is natural inherent variation. So we couldn't keep looking at single years images. They needed to be integrated. And so some commercial software have this called normalized yield. They don't tell you how many years basically fluctuates from being high yield to low yield. So we have very clear understanding of how one pixel is different from the neighbor and how one pixel changes over time. And so that allows us to put it together in this yield stability. So how consistent your field is. There are parts that are consistent, they're like stable, and we call high and stable. Others, they're on average, medium, they do fare relatively well all the time. And parts that they're constantly doing not well, and others that they go some years well and some years not as well. And so those are the unstable. Now, when you look at imagery, it's what drives yield variability is both nutrients, water, and how many plants, right? Which are affected by all the things that we just said, topography, climate. And so when you look at, be able to measure the fever of the plant, that's physically what it is. Does a plant run a fever? Is that hotter than a certain threshold? And so you basically realize how close these two maps look like. So you have a thermal stability map. You map these 40 images that AirScout has kindly taken for us, and you put it together and you see that there are areas that they are cold and stable. What does cold mean? It means that it's cooler. It means it has enough water to transpire. It has enough water to do photosynthesis and be well. Look at the yield map, high and stable. This blue area received the same weather of the yellow area. Okay, it's a different soils, but the weather is the same. So it's not just the weather. It's the combination of these interactions, synergies, and feedbacks. And so these unstable yields depend on obviously on weather and soils, and they match the instability on yields. And so we're learning a lot by how we separate optical from optical, meaning chlorophyll, like how they reflect the light, with fever and temperature, by separating if it's water stress or nitrogen stress. The way you see it here, the hot and stable, it didn't matter how much nitrogen you put it there. It didn't have enough water to take it out. And that's what farmers have to understand, that there are tools to manage better. And so now you have yield stability, thermal stability, optical stability, and we see and we integrate them into basically one product that helps make better decision altogether. So this is an example. For every field, we generate the yield stability on the left, you see, and it's partitioned now much more refiner. Unstable depressions. So what does that mean? Some years, depressions are the highest yielding areas. When? In the dry years. In the wet years, those are the ones they produce the lowest. Okay, unstable slope, pretty much not doing well unless it rains, really good distribution of rain. And unstable hilltop, same thing, it depends. on rain distribution. Now, I mean, soil gives an impact as well because of the depth. So you have a digital elevation model. We have high resolution digital elevation model. So to you, the field may look flat. It is really variable. Then soils. Look how many soil types do you have. Do the soil, resemble the yield map? Partially, yes, but not necessarily for all the other areas that are under the same soils. But soil, topography plays a role, as you can see in the lower left corner of that field. Then we have what we call a terrain wetness index. Where does the water flow? Where does the water accumulate? And so you can see the unstable depression there, matching the areas where the water tends to accumulate and flow. When you put it all together, this is a layer that unfortunately no commercial company has really kind of put it together in a way that simulates what's happening to give a proper rate. This is just another example, but again, many soil types, different variations. Some of the areas the plant doesn't care about differences in soils. It's good enough to be able to do the process. Beautiful digital elevation model, a lot of variation. Water flows where it tends to accumulate, and you see the matching areas of having too much water or too little water. Yield stability, topography, soil flow, all together for any of these fields. We have this sorts of knowledge, which, again, interestingly enough, you see all the red edges on there matching a depressional component. You see in the DM, the darker and the orangey and gray is the highest, the lighter green the lowest. When water tends to accumulate, it's unstable, but it could be may not necessarily reflect the soil differences. Okay, one more example and so on, just to give you a breath of how critical the yield stability map is. And it's the best integrator by far, because one map alone won't be able to. If any machine learning algorithm is function of only topography, you got to put it all together to be able to reproduce the yield stability. So not being satisfied enough to be able to depend on yield maps, because some farmers have yield maps. About 45% of the US Midwest Corn Belt is mapped. And actually, the 57% is mapped, 46% is used in terms of visualizing and doing things, maybe not too much besides visualizing the variations. But we used remotely sensed imagery, and we use the same principle as you've seen for thermal. We now have, so we use NASA satellite, we have field boundaries, crop data layers, fertilizer reported, and we learned that 48% of within field variability is high and stable. 27% is unstable, but of that 27%, 64 is high and stable, and 26 is low yielding. Okay, so when you combine the two, roughly about 70% of the fields have a relatively good yield, some fluctuate, but there is a quarter, 25% of yields that they are not as productive. That doesn't mean they don't produce. So when it's not justifiable to put the same amount of investment and inputs on 120 bushel corn or 110 bushel corn, because given the prices, despite the fact they're increasing a little bit now, but they're still not sufficient to justify that input, because what we learned that the pollution, the losses of nitrogen comes from those zones. So farmers have a real opportunity to convert and flip this completely by saying, I am not growing these areas, with corn, I'm reducing the amount of fertilizer, and it's good all around. So you learn more about the details of this analysis, but there is basically a producer loses about 600 million that basically buys the fertilizer, imagining dumping on the ground, on the parking lot, and then go spread the rest, because it's about on a 45% efficiency. So 45 it's taken up and 55 is lost. And what it means in terms of what we put back into the atmosphere from the production of the fertilizer. So you can get a tile, any tile in the US, you have how much nitrogen surplus, cost of production. And this is also very interesting, a work that recently came out with a postdoc in my lab, Martinez Feria, we know the areas within a field, like what you have seen, the unstable depression in the top, they have a tendency to be water deficit, and others that they're prone to be excess water. So what's the cost on the yield of that, whether on a dry year? So if you look, it's not a complicated graph. If you look at rainfall, if you go this way to the right where the arrow is, it means higher rainfall. If you look at the blue line, it's the excess water, the depressional area. As rainfall increases, yield decreases. Opposite, in the water-prone, water deficit areas, if rainfall increases, yield increases, right? But the gap between the average is 33% yield reduction. And you know well that these areas, this behavior happens simultaneously in the field at the same year. So on average, we lose just by weather 20% of the yield by not matching the proper input on these areas. And so we've been able to scale and have a knowledge of what are the lowland positions, investment on tile drains and unstable zones in upland water deficit, where wouldn't necessarily justify irrigation unless big enough, or potentially the new system by 360 or so. Low and stable areas tend to be on the edge of the field. And there is also a large fraction of these areas being more in the middle of the field. So we know exactly where they are across all the 90 million acres of the US. So as you move away, so this is measured information, so there is no estimation. As you move away from the field, the yields tend to get better. And every farmer knows for various reasons. Animals eating, heterogeneity of the stands. This is a clear picture of their runoff from the roads, tree shading, all kinds of compaction, drift. There is not a single cause. But also, you probably all remember that fields were smaller and there was a waterways in the middle, there was a fence line. You could actually see fence line I need to take you back. I think it's worth, for example, one of these fields, it was very visible to me that right here, if you see the cursor, this was a former field. This was a former field, like fence lines that they joined, and they're low and stable areas now because of previous just different compactions and roots and so on. So heterogeneity of the stand, let's go deeper on that. It's just like, what do we look? The question is, do corn plants emerge at the same time? So we looked at very detailed study, repeated many times, and we monitor these plants just basically every minute. And they all came out under natural condition. They all came out together. Okay, so that's these plants. Corn is pretty much a soldier. It's just uniform. It's being bred out from genetic variations, and so no differences here in temperature. We go to the field and we have time-lapse camera in several growers' fields. These are real fields managed normally, and the story is different. It isn't as natural. It is. 3 plants came out right there. The rest came out a few days later, and so on. Heterogeneity of the stand and uniformity of emergence is, I would put right on top of a yield potential. So lots of missing plants, a lot of variations in these plants. So I stop there, but missing plant, missing plant, missing plant, all these plants, that's a missing yield. You have to have a large enough skip of 3 plants to have 20% compensation on these 2 year. They get a little bit more light. So missing plant. The other interesting thing that we learned, when you have a plant that emerged earlier, and the neighbor do not follow at the same time, this plant does not grow as much. It still is the biggest. It goes, but it's not as big as if plants come out all together. So when they come out all together, the competition pushes them to be much stronger, much higher. And so the standalone plant followed by plants that don't come out together do not reach the same potential. It's the highest compared to the neighbor, but not as high as the plants coming uniformly all together. Okay, so that's, don't know what we can do about that in terms of selecting the right time. So high yielding areas, what did we learn? High yielding areas, they come out earlier, the good areas, confirmed across several, this is a 4th year of study that we do on farmers' fields, come out earlier and come out uniform versus the low and the unstable that they come later, very heterogeneous, with obviously impact on grain number and grain size. So this is some of the one of the fields of study where highest stable had, the low and stable had the same behavior, that the first plant was bigger and higher yield than the others, but it wasn't as big as, the other plants. And so how do we, if we know that there are not the same amount of planting in areas, you obviously cannot feed, you will never feed the same, you will never cook the same amount of food if you have 2 people or 10 people, right? It's an example, but that's where understanding spatial variation and how we manage nitrogen, that's how we do it. So you have the 3 categories of behavior, a hot and dry, a typical or normal or more cold and wet years. And so we simulate the response, and we know as the year goes by. So this was an actual, this was the original rate that was applied. The black line, it was the year we're doing, this slide was. The updated end rate, basically they stopped responding, and that's the amount that, we designed in the prescription and the farmer put it on. By saving this updated rate, saved money and environmental impact. So how do? We basically run the response on cold and dry, cold and normal, cold and wet, and be able to see the responses of nitrogen until you see which year of your year is similar to one of the previous years. So the analog kind of component, the analogy, and see the responses across, high and stable, medium and stable, low and stable. Well, look at the performance in the low and stable. It doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put. And this is it's simulated, but it was confirmed with the yields, because we always, you use a model, but you also want to verify. And so there will be no right to say, hey, this is, and then it was wrong. Low and stable, no response whatsoever, because the most of the time they're running out of water and not nutrients. Also because very few farmers have put variable rate. And so the amount of nitrogen that you put on this low and stable is the same, showing that for the last 10 years, 170, 180 bushel didn't do any good. You still continue to be a low and stable areas. And so this is, again, start linking now management with soils, with topography, with weather. And so we have a knowledge of where the water content is for any of these fields, and where within the 30 years of weather. And so you have, these are the high and stable zones, significant greater amount of water. So your bets, you betting on a winning horses here, versus other areas where you just doesn't do any good because you don't have enough soil water to be able to pull the nitrogen. So the unstable, hilltop, low and stable. And those are basically the premises to be able to have a proper variable rate met. So now I did a study. This is an example of one field, just to show you when you have an answer, when someone asks like, oh, should I apply nitrogen at planting? All the planting, is it okay if I put it all the planting, put my eggs all in one basket? Or should I vary it in side dressing? Should I look for side dressing? What do you think my answer is going to be? I would say, well, it depends. There isn't a single answer, unfortunately. I wish there was. What are the factors? Well, the weather, normal, hot and dry. So that's the top and the responses. I know this may be overwhelming. I'm trying to walk you through, but then you have the zones. So you have high and stable, medium and stable, low and stable, unstable depression. Then we did no-till and spring tillage, trying to do the 2 combinations of the typical approaches. We also use no nitrogen whatsoever. Let's find out how much mineralization is on these soils. How much can they yield for a number of years? And so let's look at the high and stable, the blue line with no-till, just as an example. Then no nitrogen, it gives you 120 bushels. Okay, pretty strong penalty. Side dressing, only a side dressing, no much difference in the side dress in the yields. It's still a good yield, because remember, with no nitrogen, you still were able to pull out 120 is about 70 to 80 pounds of end that were taken up. So in addition to the 170 that you put in, you have an excess of additional, ranging between 50, almost 100 that is available in the soil. You don't want to, pull it out all at once. But so basically, the responses is that the rates did not have an impact. The lower the rates, now side dressing only in a normal year gave you a lower yield, okay? On a planting only, lower yield. Side dress only, and the split application didn't necessarily help. Why? Because it did not have enough water on this particular field. So it shows that the distribution of the rain and the side dressing gave you what is a storage, good storage of water to be able, so the answer is you need to monitor that, because the more you move on, the more you know what type of year you're in. So not knowing, putting all the egg in one basket, it doesn't really help in terms of the weather. Here, the weather was the factor. But if you move across the zones, it's very different response. You go from 199 to 159 to 80. Okay, so basically the inherent variability is greater than some of the management strategies. And the weather on top of it will basically exacerbate the responses. I don't know if it's overwhelming, but unfortunately that's how it is. So inherent variability dominates by far, the conditions, because it's a proxy for soil storage, fertility, mineralization rates, and the possibility of coping, with the weather. I gotta move faster. I didn't realize I'm enjoying talking to you. Here is a response for you, just in a different way of visualizing. And so you see from, 170 side dress, it does vary from basically one type of management to another, but it varies with the zones, not within the same zones or with the weather. What does vary, though, that we don't have anything in terms of, conditions, but the amount of nitrogen that is lost is different. So the yield did not vary across the management, but if you put side dress only and, 120 or even 0, or 120 or 170, you have only 90, you have 96 kilogram on the unstable slope, but you lose 105, 103.9, sorry, 104 in the high and stable zone under cold and wet. Now that leaching goes down in the in other zones, but in the hot and dry, it's also high because plants did not use it. And so this doesn't mean it's lost within the season, but it's lost after. Basically, leaching occurs in the fall and the spring after thawing. You have these big flushes of up to 50 to 60 ppm. Multiplied by 2, you got pounds per acre. And so you have 100 pounds lost. So you want to manage again into a system and looking at the environmental component as well. That's still money lost for you because you paid for that fertilizer. Okay, same way of different, but the responses are different. The numbers look similar, but they vary between weather type, soil type, meaning the unstable zones and scenarios. So we write prescription, we have yields. For example, this is 67 fields in Michigan measured, where we have this prescription for some of these fields, and we distribute, it goes into the turnkey solution, and this brilliant farmer goes and spray automatically the amount, bringing the nitrogen use efficiency close to 1, basically 100%, with no impact on yields because they were the same. If you see on the graph above, the low and stable in the green had the same yield as the variable rate. So yield wasn't penalized. That means even if you reduce it, wasn't affected, but the efficiency goes much higher, passing over 1. These are the concepts that I know some of the farmers, at least some that I've talked to, says, I wasn't ready to see this. Well, probably but there is parts of the fields you constantly lose money. And this profit stability, it's very different than looking at single year, because you really have to look at an enterprise. You are fully an industry. Your enterprise is basically a company that has the budget, and you can't see a single year, because on a single year you can lose, but it's, so in the worst case scenario, what I mean is like, if you made money 1 year, you still have to, it can be a unique year. And so if you do a profit stability, like the map on the left, and you integrate, so this is 11 years of corn, 11 years of yield data for yield stability, 7 years of corn, you can lose in the high losing areas, you can lose over $200 per acre, okay? And that doesn't justify, and so we're trying to help in either minimize losses by putting less nitrogen, or changing to precision conservation or carbon farming as it's coming now for the rest of the talk. So we can simulate at field scale. This is another example of using the models if only based on soil versus if we parameterize with yield stability map. So you see the areas and the changes in yield over the different low and stable, high and stable depression. Unstable depression you see is mostly green, but in some years it loses money because of excess amount of water. And well, we have an analysis of a profit, and some parts can lose up to $400. This is maybe to some other states, not in, in Michigan. This analysis was done where we had the field boundaries, now is extended to others. So not all the acreage were covered in this analysis in Michigan. And anyway, you have lots of losses. The reason here is, again, by showing these measurements that low and stable constantly give you lower yields measured, despite the fact that nitrogen was used with the same rate. And so if you put profitability in the middle, you have variable rate on the areas that respond, you got the blue map above, and potentially having biodiversity strips, native vegetation on the edges of the field on the low and stable areas, which are rewarded. Now I'm working hard to make CRP within subfield variability and be able to get a higher amount. We have an NRCS grant where we incentivize farmer to put biodiversity edge of fields, buffer zones, to be able to reduce pollution, and bringing income from both the carbon that you sequester as carbon stocks and carbon potentially joining a carbon credit program. So precision conservation is certainly something that it will be coming to you with potential economic benefits. So we know where these low and stable areas are across the field throughout the US. This, you can look at Michigan. Michigan has a total, multiply that by 2, sorry, that is in hectare, but we have about over 1.5 million of field edges, so perimeters, and we have nearly over 1 million of low and stable areas that they're currently produced, and 300,000 are on the edge of the field, okay? Close to 40% are edges of field, low and stable, that could be allocated. So this number is very valuable. Also, we characterize the sizes of the fields. So less 1 to 5 hectares, basically between 5 and 10 acres, 5 to 15 and 15. So the interesting thing is if you farm, smaller, field sizes, you have a much greater percentage of fraction of total areas that are feet of, field edge. And so this is 67% now is field edge with, again, the possibility of having lower yield there. So in Michigan, again, when you see 0 to 30 is the field edges, the field edges still has good zones. Don't get me wrong. So 39% is good, but 31% is basically low and stable, and 30% fluctuates in the case of Michigan. 0 to 30 is meters from the edge. Okay, and we have it for all the US. Well, I don't know if this is a good idea, but everybody pushes for, cover crops. You got to plant cover crop. I mean, it's a very good idea to plant cover crop, no question asked, but can we use these edge of fields to grow some, as a native vegetation to be able to grow it for seeds for the rest? It depends. If they're big enough areas and some entire fields could be allocated, that's an idea. But here is the possibility of showing that the different level of yields, red clover, oats and cereals. So basically in Michigan, you can grow all of them if you have high yield, but if the yields are lower, then you can only grow basically red clover, oats, and cereals. And the low and stable areas on the edge of the field will be able to feed. Now only 10% of the Midwest is grown that are cover crop, 10%. There are no seeds available. There is a hidden cost of an area where this cover crop for seeds need to be grown. And so this is potentially an idea to be able to grow your own seeds to put it in and get incentives from NRCS and so on. So we're going into that direction. Now, the composition of grasslands that improves by having that with all the benefits of biodiversities and there are lots of companies working on that, Pheasants Forever, Duck Unlimited, all the areas where, why losing $300 where you can get basically $200 in payment and reduce pollution. So if we were now going towards the end, this is an analysis that is pretty striking. That if we were to remove the edge of fields where all the areas that they are in the middle. So here is middle means in the middle of the field. So Michigan has 300, so basically 700,000 acres that they are constantly underperforming, and they're greater than 1 acre. We did the analysis of the pixel. Greater than 1 acre that could be allocated to that. It's basically, and the edge of the field is about 500,000. And so if you combine that, the amount of nitrogen that you save is basically paid for in these incentives, you can reduce all the amount of nitrogen that goes, not just in Michigan, in general, by doing this approach, that goes in the Mississippi River, which is 1.1 teragrams. In the end, there is an opportunity for farmers to sequester carbon through partially growing high yielding corn and not grow corn where it needs nitrogen because it basically puts a lot of it into the atmosphere. Regenerative practices are the ones basically biodiversity, changing crops, rotations, be able to adapt nitrogen. And the greenhouse gas emissions is very important. It can be reduced in terms of managing where you can show you have reduced the amount of nitrogen, you could reduce the emissions. And so I've worked out together, actually the corn growers at the Candley showed a very big interest in helping the growers of Michigan understanding more about this in one of the grants that we're working on. The difficult thing is soil sampling. It's out of the picture. It's very complicated, lots of variability, very time consuming, costly. So there's a combination of some sampling with modeling, and that's the way we're going and the way we're verifying these practices. And I'm actually working on a new project that I'm just personally, I'm investing in both time and effort in creating an ID, basically like a carbon identification number, like what you have in ethanol for RINs, and because be able to identify and be able to close the loop of the uncertainties of this carbon credit, not knowing exactly where they go. In the end, we ran models and scenarios. So if you're interested in knowing how much carbon you are able to sequester, we do it in the lab. There is a private company that does that for free. You can click on SIBO Technologies, which I have to disclaim that I uses the technology so that they license from Michigan State. And so I'm the co-founder of that company, but I don't have that. I work for Michigan State, and that's a different thing. So you can quantify on your field what is the possibility of converting and accumulating carbon if you were to move from conventional tillage to no tillage and cover crops, or the amount of nitrogen, both carbon that you accumulate or nitrogen that you reduce. This is another way that we're looking in this project, is be able to have a conversion of from the as applied map into the carbon credits from every single application. So we have trying to work on an automated way of quantifying carbon credits from reduced nitrogen application. And so in the end, the story is you can invest into the areas where these plants are doing well and continue to have high yield, or basically not apply as much nitrogen or convert into precision conservation and save up to 500 kilograms of CO2 in addition to the one that you sequester from the corn. And so this, this is just one example of a field. It can be up to $10 or $20 an acre, but remember, this is only an initial kind of price. We're pushing for, higher prices to be able that potentially will become your way of farming if the tons goes over 50. So in the end, we can run it for across the whole Midwest. What did you see? You saw an integration of big data, remote sensing, policy, and be able to see again, either nitrogen or biodiversity, landscape tools to help design better policy and make better decisions for farmers. With that, I thank you for the attention, and I need to thank this talented group of lab members, students, and staff that tirelessly work, with me, and the funding agencies, including particularly, the corn growers in this case. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry I went over, but
well, Doctor, we really appreciate all the information that you've given us so far. I'm very curious. Your research has been ongoing for how many years now?
Well, I'm relatively new to Michigan State, because even though I'm a true Spartan, I did my PhD here, but I've been back only 7 years.
So we're looking at potentially many more years of research going into this project, aren't we?
For sure. Every year is an exponential return. It's just the amount of things that we learn in 1 year due to technology. It gets greater and greater. I mean, Jim has heard me speak many times. It takes quite a bit of time to kind of digest this. It's drinking water out of a fire hydrant. I realized that. I tried to talk slow and be able to show things that they were tangibles, but from the first seminar, Jim, that we presented on showing the models and some of the yield maps and see where we are now, that we could potentially package, a carbon credits as applied and yield stability across all the corn growers. It's a pretty giant step within a few years.
I'm just kind of curious, does this mean what we're looking at right now is very possibly a substitute for soil testing, or will there never be a substitute for that?
No, unfortunately, that could potentially be. Soil testing is important, but not necessarily to make decision on nitrogen. Nitrogen is extremely variable. Plants are, significantly better indicators of what they see, because you can test an area and you basically knew already that was low altogether for the last 10 years. So sampling could be better designed, but you could sample for other elements, micronutrients, or if you want to have a general idea of a soil health indicators, to be able to, integrate all these measurements. Sampling has also changed significantly. I don't know if you've seen some of the machines, they take thousands of samples as they drive by, automatically, and potentially a combination, but I would certainly use plants as indicator better than soil alone.
Jim, are there any questions that have come up from our viewers?
So right now on your screen, there is a survey that we'd like for all the participants to go ahead and fill out, if you would. And so that we can it kind of goes on with the survey that Dr. Bruno already has, but again, this is just for kind of what we're after. Hopefully out of this whole presentation, many of our growers took home the fact that we really got to start to analyze our fields, that maybe we shouldn't be applying, obviously that full amount of nitrogen to the whole entire field. Maybe we should be looking at the edge of our fields, looking for something else to do with those, because when we start to do our analysis, we realize we're not making any money. Matter of fact, we're losing money on that area. That will then lead us into some different policies that we have. And so, Bruno, I do thank you for taking my my SIN credits, my carbon identification number idea, because that's the only way that I see this thing working into the future, much like we have in the ethanol with our renewable identification numbers. But sure. One of the questions that, I guess the only question we're going to take, because we did run over, when you do apply your nitrogen and you base that off of your maps, are you trying to, are you applying the nitrogen just to the good producing areas from the image, or are you trying to apply more nitrogen to the lower producing areas to try and bring those up?
Yeah, no, as I tried to show a little bit, clearly, you would put nitrogen in the high producing area, and you would minimize as much as possible in the low yielding areas. The reason is, if the yield stability has shown to you clearly that for the last 10 years of this yield stability analysis, that areas was always underperforming and received the same amount of nitrogen, why do you want to put more if that wasn't taken up? If you keep producing 120, 130, and you put 180 pounds per acre on those areas, that's more than sufficient to do that. And we have shown with the measurements and the variable rate that 120 should only receive possibly 80 pounds or something if you even want to continue to have nitrogen put it on those zones. Those zones should actually have a second thought of doing something else in terms of sequestering more carbon and through the biodiversity and reduce pollution. So it's the high yielding zones that you need to invest in.
So that will be a hard concept for many. I know we've had that discussion around even our boardroom about that. However, I think once you actually see that question on that, or start to question it, you'll understand why. So with that, Bruno, we want to thank you. And as you've said, I've been hearing this dialogue now for many years. It takes quite a while for a person to comprehend it and to understand it, because it is complex. But once you do grasp it, it does make a whole lot of sense. And again, what we're after is the profitability of our farmers. We're saving the nutrients on our environment. This does set the stage and provide us the data, because I think that you'll start to see this come out in our policies here, definitely probably within the next Farm Bill, if not before. So again, this data is very helpful to making the correct decisions on that. So
right.
With that, I'm actually going to turn it back over to Terry then.
All righty. Doctor, again, thank you very much for being a part of our program. Jim, thank you very much for your comments and suggestions. I don't know about you, and I don't know about a lot of our viewers, but I'll tell you, there were so many numbers. I'm going to have to review this program again, but I think the whole point of it is obviously we do want to make it a lot more productive for our farmers. And Doctor, you have got the research there. It's just a matter of utilizing that research, and we appreciate your presentation today. Now, if you're watching us on the Zoom, we want you to fill out the questions that are on the screen. Now, we'll be ending the stream. So at this time, we want to say goodbye to our friends that are viewing us on the Facebook stream. So if you're watching us on the Zoom, hang tight, because we do have RUP and CCA credit information available to you right now. Again, thank you very much for joining us. This week's edition of Coffee with Corn, brought to you by the Corn Marketing Program here in Michigan. Now, if you're looking for more ways to expand your skills and knowledge, we do have another opportunity that's coming up. We're going to be hosting a 3-session Grain Marketing 101 workshop. Now, that's going to be starting February the 23rd. More information is available on the website, so just go to micorn.org. Next week, we're going to talk about trade. We're going to talk about United States and China. And we've got an expert who's pretty sharp on that, and I think you're going to want to know a little bit more about it, especially in lieu of the fact that we do have a new administration, and very possibly what their strategy might be. So we're going to look forward to seeing that a week from today, beginning at 8 o'clock sharp here on Coffee with Corn. Now, to register, review the full schedule of upcoming events, you can go to www.micorn.org/events. I'm Terry Henney, and again, for all of you, hang on. The information right now is coming up on your CCA and your RUP credits.